Hello, dear viewers. Welcome to today's tutorial. I imagine that you are never surprised about any of my topics. You've probably come to expect me to talk about anything under the sun, and today is no different. In the last tutorial, I discussed the differences between the terms cause, risk, association, and link. And I told you that one of the reasons I was presenting a video on those differences is that for every disease related to menopause, I'll give you a list of risk factors that help you determine whether or not you are at risk for that disease. Well, for some diseases, you'll notice risk factors that are related to race, ethnicity, nationality, or religious affiliation. Now, you may be thinking, so what? That's easy. But actually, it's not that easy. And that's because the very meanings, distinctions, and limitations of race, ethnicity, nationality, and religious affiliation are not as clear-cut as you might have imagined. So this video will explain the distinctions and even a little bit of the history between them. You'll be shocked at how much of this you did not know. So if you are of any race, any ethnicity, any nationality, or any religious affiliation, you need to watch this video. Ha! I guess that means everyone should watch it. We'll start with race, and we'll begin the discussion with a little bit of history. Race refers to a category of people who share certain inherited physical characteristics, such as skin color, facial features, and stature. Originally, people believed that all humans originated from one common ancestor, and factually speaking, all humans belong to the species Homo sapiens. But as people migrated around the world over the millennia, natural selection took over. Natural selection favored dark skin for people who lived in hot, sunny climates, like near the equator. That's because dark skin has lots of melanin to protect against severe sunburn and skin cancer. Alternatively, natural selection favored light skin for people who migrated farther from the equator to cooler, less sunny climates. And that's because dark skin in those parts of the world would have interfered with the production of vitamin D. Originally, there were only 3 races: white or Caucasian, black or Negroid, and yellow or Mongoloid. These racial classification schemes considered physical traits such as skin color, eye color, hair texture, nose shape, mouth size, and lip thickness. But it also linked those things to intellectual capacities, cultural traits, and moral temperaments. And over time, racial classification shifted from purely biological differences in physical appearance to an indicator of power relationships between different groups of people. And eventually, these races were ranked. People of different races were not considered equal in aesthetic beauty, intelligence, temperament, or morality. So ultimately, it subordinated groups of people based on their racial differences. Not only that, race came to have legal and political identities, and it even affected so-called scientific thinking. Now that's where you're going to see it come into play with regard to risk factors for diseases. In some cases, all aspects of one's economic, intimate, social, and political life are structured along racial lines. And the net result is that race alone, without all these other influences, may not be as significant as all of them together when it comes to your risk for a disease. And because race came to signify so much more than race, the very names of the races began to change in order to make them more politically correct. Instead of calling people black, we called them African American. Now, obviously, not everyone who is black is African or American. And the word Mongoloid became politically incorrect, so we started calling Mongoloid people Asian. Well, Asian is a geographic term, not a racial term. But the factual aspects of race became lost in the need to be politically correct. And then people started confusing race with ethnicity. Now, we'll address ethnicity itself in a bit, but for now, I want to touch on this point. So Hispanic started getting included in the list of race options. Hispanics are not a racial group. Hispanics are white. They just happen to have darker skin than some whites. But the word Hispanic means that you speak Spanish. And that means it includes people living in all the following regions: Spain, which is Europe, Central America, South America, Cuba, and Puerto Rico. They're scattered all over the place. And then there's American Indians. Now, American Indians constitute a culture, not a race. They're white too. So you can see how ethnicity has become intermingled with race. Now, back in the days when travel was difficult or impossible, racial groups were fairly pure. But as people started migrating from place to place, they started interbreeding. And of course, that creates a mixing of the races. In other words, there's been a whole lot of hanky-panky going on between the races for as far back as humanity has existed. So if you thought you were a purebred of any type, you're probably mistaken. The fact is that there isn't much in the way of purity of race these days. Instead, there's a whole lot of mishmash of the races. In many places, racial categories have been added, removed, revised, and altered during the past 300 years. This has occurred in response to demographic changes, immigration, political mobilization, technologies, cultural shifts, and economic interests, as well as hanky-panky. And the racial classifications have not been considered equally. For instance, in the United States, there is something called the one-drop rule. The one-drop rule states that if a person of multiracial ancestry has even one drop of black blood, they are considered black, regardless of their appearance, cultural training, or self-identification. There are many examples of this. Former President Obama is half white and half black, but he considers himself black. The golfer Tiger Woods is typically called African American, but in fact, his ancestry is one half Asian, which is divided equally between Chinese and Thai, 1/4 white, 1/8 Native American, and only 1/8 African American. Census rules have even changed to reflect the fact that the races are impure. So now some of the census forms include categories like mixed race, multiracial, and other. They ought to have a classification for ancestral hanky-panky. We'd all have to check it. In essence, race has become more of a social construct than a biological construct. And now we often see more physical differences within a race than between races. For example, some people who identify themselves as white have very light skin, while others have much darker skin. In fact, some whites have darker skin than some blacks. Some whites have very straight hair, while others have very curly hair. Some have blonde hair and blue eyes, while others have dark hair and brown eyes. And of course, there is every combination imaginable. It is estimated that at least 30% of blacks have some white ancestry, and that at least 20% of whites have some black ancestry. If clear racial differences ever existed hundreds or thousands of years ago, and many scientists doubt that such differences ever existed, these differences have become increasingly blurred. Tisk, tisk, tisk. Hanky-panky. When I lived in South Africa, I learned that black is not black. On multiple occasions, when riding in an Uber car with a black driver, I was taken aback when my black driver said something derogatory about black people. It turns out that there are really many shades of black in South Africa. And the designation colored refers to people of mixed black and white descent there. But to be colored in South Africa, both parents have to be colored. So sometimes black people said something derogatory about colored people. Whenever something like this happened, I just changed the subject because I had no idea what to say. Saying, "You look dark enough to be black yourself" would have been inappropriate. Yet that's what I was thinking. You see, in South Africa, there are many shades of black. And black and colored are not the same thing. I wrote articles about all the places I've lived, and while living there in South Africa, I wrote an article called 50 Shades of Black. You can find it on my website if you want to read it. There's another interesting twist to the difference between blacks, whites, and coloreds in South Africa. During apartheid in the 1950s, the government had difficulty classifying people into black, white, and colored categories. So they came up with a nifty test called the pencil test. The pencil test involved poking a pencil into the hair of the person of questionable race. If it got stuck, the person failed and was labeled colored. If it fell out, the person passed and was labeled white. They even developed a version of the pencil test for blacks who wished to be reclassified. It was called the pencil shake test. The black person who wanted to be reclassified as a colored person would stick a pencil in their hair and then shake their head. If the pencil fell out, they passed and were reclassified as colored. If it stayed in place, they stayed black. The pencil test was obviously inaccurate and resulted in tearing whole families apart. Plus, what do you do with people who are bald? Or what if their hair is too short to insert a pencil in the first place? I wrote an article about this too. It's called South African Hair Affairs, and you can find it on my website, which is menopausetaylor.me. And here's the thing that overrides everything else. Genetically, people from different races have DNA that is more than 99.9% the same. In other words, less than 0.1% of all your DNA accounts for the physical differences among people that constitute race. So actually, people with different racial backgrounds are much, much, much more similar than dissimilar. Are you shocked? The bottom line is that we're all a bunch of mutts, and now you understand why. It's due to hanky-panky mixed with a lot of other things. So let's move on to ethnicity. Ethnicity refers to the shared social, cultural, and historical experiences among people with similar national or regional backgrounds. So these are things that make subgroups of a population different from one another. An ethnic group is a subgroup of a population with a set of shared social, cultural, and historical experiences. They have relatively distinctive beliefs, values, and behaviors, and they have the same sense of identity, of belonging to the subgroup. So the terms ethnicity and ethnic group avoid the biological connotations of the terms race and racial group. But ethnicity still carries prejudice, discrimination, and attempts at ethnic cleansing. And of course, different ethnic groups have engaged in hanky-panky too. And that has blurred the lines between ethnic groups in the same ways it has blurred the lines between races. With regard to your risk factors for diseases, you'll occasionally see a particular ethnic group at higher risk than others. But realize that this will be more about common behaviors among the people in that group. It won't be as much about their biological differences from other groups. But like race, there has been so much crossover between ethnicities that most people don't even know their true ethnicity. Have you ever seen one of those commercials about ancestry or DNA testing? Typically, they depict a person who thought they knew their ethnicity, but alas, they find out that they were all wrong. They learn that apparently there was some hanky-panky in the past, and turns out that they're just a mutt, like everybody else. Okay, so what about nationality? Nationality refers to your identity in terms of citizenship. It defines your country of origin or habitation. Your citizenship is your nationality. The country that issued your passport is your nationality. So nationality is only about where you live. Now, of course, where you live will have an effect on some of your risks for diseases, but it's not biological. You can be any race and any ethnicity and live anywhere. Nationality is more of a legal status for purposes of voting and other rights. And your true nationality and your national identity may not match. National identity is your subjective sense of belonging to one nation. But you can be a national of a country in the sense of being a citizen, but have no subjective or emotional connection to it. For example, many people who have migrated to Europe identify with their ancestral background rather than with their country of citizenship. And conversely, you may feel like you belong to a particular country without having any legal relationship to it. For instance, young children who come to the U.S. illegally have very little contact with their native country and its culture, but they often still have a national identity of feeling like a citizen of their native country. So for some diseases, you might see a higher risk for a particular nationality. Now, if you've only lived in one country all your life, your nationality is easy. But if you've lived on every continent except Antarctica like I have, it's a little more tricky. So it's possible to be a mutt with regard to your nationality too. And it may or may not have anything to do with hanky-panky. And finally, we have religious affiliation. Now, of course, this refers to your religious identity, but it's really about how you choose to worship. It's about certain behaviors and beliefs. Your religious affiliation may determine various things about your diet and lifestyle. And that's really what's at the core of any religious affiliation affecting your risk of disease. But in addition to that, you have to take into account that people of the same religious affiliation may share geographic location, they tend to intermarry, and ultimately they may share more genetic traits than people outside the religious affiliation. So be sure to consider these things when you see a religious affiliation as a risk factor for a disease. And of course, if you have a mixed religious background, you might just be a mutt. Just because you're religious does not mean you have no hanky-panky in your past. So now you know all these different categories will be things you see in the list of risk factors for various diseases. So take what you've learned here today into account when you see them. While they all have some significance, they also have some limitations. By themselves, none of them determines your risk for anything, because for the most part, we're all a bunch of mutts. Forgive me for calling you a mutt, but you know that I mean it in the most loving way. And accept the fact that people have been engaging in hanky-panky between different social groups for ages. So that's where I'll stop. Join me in a week, and that's when I'll teach you how to approach the HRT choosing process. So many women have asked, where do I begin? And next week, I'll walk you through the process of beginning HRT, assessing how it's working for you, and changing your HRT if necessary. In the meantime, visit my website, which is menopausetailor.me, subscribe to my channel, and follow me on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. I'll see you next week. Bye.